Hey, you guys. Welcome to History of Thought 2. Um, I am recording this, enjoying one of probably the last nice summery days of the year, so hopefully the background ambient noise isn't too much. So this week we're going to be talking about issues of class struggle and race. So this week we'll be reading a very prominent African-American intellectual influenced by Marx, and also applying some of Marx's ideas about class conflict to understanding how class and racial conflict can intersect in American history. So if you just read the Communist Manifesto and Marx's more academic writings like Capital Volume 1, and these are both from which your readings from last week from Marx were excerpts from kind of his more academic writing, it would be very easy and quite reasonable to conclude that Marx does not handle issues of race and ethnicity very well. His model of history and class conflict is very Eurocentric, and he presents it as universal history, even though it's drawing on Greek society, on feudal Europe, on capitalist 19th century Europe. Also, it seems to not really fit into the United States' situation in the 19th century very well, which, by the second half of the 1800s, the United States is this emerging industrial capitalist economy, especially in the north of the U.S. But in the South, it's still very much a society based on slavery. And I'll also remember, industrialists in the North are very much profiting from this slavery in the South, too. And the United States extracts a lot of wealth from the labor and bodies of individuals who could not enter into wage labor because they were owned by other people. But we can also see the appeal of Marx and Marxism to marginalized peoples all over the world. Marx's ideas will become especially important in the 20th century to anti-colonial movements in what was at the time called the Third World, but to basically places around the world that had been colonized by Europe and the United States and victims of Western imperialism. But these ideas also become very appealing in the 20th century for groups pushing for racial and social justice within industrialized countries, such as African Americans in the United States. Marx's writings really kind of imply a certain solidarity of all marginalized people, right? That if you're marginalized within the capitalist system, that you should all unite and rise up because you have nothing to lose but your chains. So this isn't just a call for the white working class. This is really a call for the entire working class, all marginalized people. However, Marx himself isn't just an intellectual, he's a journalist. It was actually his first career when he was young, when he couldn't get a university job. His journalistic writings are actually what gets him into trouble into continental Europe and why he eventually has to flee to London, where he spends over the last over 30 years of his life in London in exile. And journalism is something he continues in London, and it's really his journalistic writings are how he mostly supports himself and his family. He's not making a lot of money off the Communist Manifesto. And Marx, in the 1850s and 1860s, is actually a correspondent for an American newspaper, for the New York Daily Tribune from 1852 to 1862. And at the time, the New York Daily Tribune, it was Horace Greeley's newspaper, a famous American publisher. It was one of the largest circulating papers in the United States. And Marx writes for the New York Daily Tribune typically about events in Europe for American readers, but he does also write articles where he weighs in on events in America from kind of this left-wing European perspective. Marx and Engels together also wrote a series of 36 articles on the situation in America and the American Civil War for a newspaper in Vienna in the early 1860s. And for both of these papers, Marx, in his journalistic writings, writes directly about the American Civil War and about the situation of slavery and African Americans. And his views on race and class in the American context seem a lot more nuanced and a lot more aware of sort of the specific circumstances of the U.S. system of slavery than his more kind of universalist writings like the Communist Manifesto or like Capital. In one news article, Marx states, quote, "In the United States of America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, wherein the black skin is branded." In 1964, Marx even wrote to President Abraham Lincoln on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, sort of a socialist labor organization in Europe, saying, quote, "The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new wave of the ascendancy of the middle class, so that the American anti-slavery war will do so for the working class." So, he's kind of seeing in the American Revolution, he's reading it as sort of the bourgeois revolution, which brings on capitalism. And perhaps anti-slavery in the Civil War for Marx could be the revolution that sort of where the workers seize the means of production. I mean, obviously that doesn't happen, but he's sort of interpreting these racial politics through his eyes, but recognizing the importance of emancipation and these racial divisions within the American working class. But for Marx, as for many left-wing and Marxist-inspired thinkers, the issue of race is simply another manifestation of class conflict. It's just another false wedge that those in power use to keep the entire proletariat class from organizing. And this has been an intense debate in left-wing political circles up to this day. It's still a debate today. Is racism simply an outgrowth of the oppression of lower economic classes, perhaps a strategy used to divide the working classes, or is it something separate and different that needs different solutions? In other words, if we solved economic inequalities, would racism go away? So for this week, we'll be approaching the issue of Marxism and race, both philosophically and historically. For the first topic this week, we'll be talking about one of the most prominent American Black intellectuals of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. You'll watch a crash course sociology video on Du Bois, which is assigned, that covers sort of his biography and his main ideas quite thoroughly. So I'm not going to give you any more information. Just watch the video and you'll get a great overview of Du Bois. But when you are watching the assigned crash course video on Du Bois and doing the two short readings by Du Bois, and this week you're reading the first chapter of his book, The Souls of Black Folks, which is very short. And you're also reading an article that Du Bois did for the magazine that he was editor of, The Crisis, and it's called Marxism and the Negro Problem. So when you're doing both of these readings, think about what Du Bois's argument is about race and class in America. Why are there two working classes in America, black and white? What separates them, and why can they not unify in solidarity, at least in Du Bois's historical moment in the early 20th century? Why does Du Bois not sort of hold the black bourgeoisie, the black kind of middle and upper classes, accountable in the same way that he does the white bourgeoisie, the white ruling classes? And how does Marxism help African American thinkers like Du Bois understand white supremacy and racism in America? And especially when you're reading that first chapter from The Souls of Black Folks, and when you're watching the video, I also want you to think very clearly about the idea of double consciousness. This is probably Du Bois's most famous idea, and it's actually a concept that we're going to come back to in a future class when we talk about sort of mid-20th century post-colonial thinker Frantz Fanon. So the second topic for this week is more historically focused. And we'll be critically applying the ideas of Marx and Du Bois to two examples from American history. So, the first example is the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. You have a short article and also an excellent documentary assigned on this historical event. So for our discussion, I want us to think about why political alliances between blacks and whites, especially blacks and working class whites, were so politically disruptive to American power structures at the time. And how the ideas of white supremacy can be used to bolster the capitalist system and keep whites of all classes invested in the perpetuation of that system. And also, if there are aspects of this historical event of the Wilmington Massacre that don't fit as neatly into Marxist explanations. The second historical example is the Black Panther Party, and we'll be looking at the 10-point program from the 1960s. The Black Panthers are explicitly Marxist philosophically and seem, very radical, and were often seen as quite controversial in the American political context. And so we can think about how they are both integrating Marxism and drawing on Du Bois, but also perhaps complexifying Marxist ideas in terms of race. And finally, I want us to reflect on what all this means for the contemporary moment where we are facing issues in regards to racism, white supremacy, and income inequality. That's still ongoing. Would seriously addressing income inequality in America help combat racism? Or is racism based on something deeper than just economic and material interests? Looking forward to talking to you guys about all of this.